Good evening. You know, if you're in the business of quoting people, quoting what they've said, it's always a good idea to be accurate, to quote people accurately, and attribute the quote to the proper source. Obviously, that doesn't always happen. I wonder how many quotes or statements we hear through life that we just accept at face value, basically, and we don't question the quote, we don't wonder about the source, who said it, who didn't say it, anything like that. We just basically accept it. And you might be surprised at the number of quotes that we do accept that never actually pass the lips of the people to whom they are attributed. And what that means is the person never actually said it. But the quote sounds good. And we like it, and consequently, we oftentimes use it. I came across some familiar quotations that probably you will know, and the sources that are attributed to them, and I just want to use these as an example tonight of what I'm talking about. I think for years I have heard and read this particular quote from Mark Twain. I've heard so many quotes from Mark Twain, I oftentimes wonder if he actually said all the things that are attributed to him, and in this case, he didn't. But here's a quote that maybe you've heard. When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much he had learned in 7 years. I've heard a different variation of that, and I've heard this for many, many years, always attributed to Mark Twain, but come to find out that experts of Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, cannot find this quote in anything he has ever written. So, as far as we know, he never said it, although it's attributed to him. Here's a quote that is attributed to Abraham Lincoln. And supposedly Lincoln said, "You can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time." The thing is, this has never been verified as having originated with Abraham Lincoln, but it's attributed to Lincoln. Now, you may prove me wrong. Maybe you have some inside sources that I don't have, but this is what I'm told. Lincoln never said it. And here's one more. "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing," is attributed to Vince Lombardi. But the truth is, it was actually said by Red Sanders at Vanderbilt in 1948 and attributed to Lombardi. But apparently Lombardi never actually said it. There are these quotes that, as far as I know, never actually came from the lips of the person to whom they are attributed. Now, you think, well, that's secular literature. That doesn't interest us here tonight. Well, let's not stop there. I have a couple of passages I want to use tonight for our thoughts. And this same idea will carry over a little bit. Let's begin tonight with Jeremiah 14, 14 through 16. The Lord said to me, "The prophets prophesy lies in my name. I have not sent them, commanded them, nor spoken to them. They prophesy to you a false vision, divination a worthless thing, and the deceit of their heart." Now I'm going to focus on verse 14 only. But if you'd like to, you can read on down through 16 to catch more of the idea. But here's the case in Jeremiah's day. The prophets were quoting what God has not said. They were preaching lies. God didn't send them. He did not inspire them. He did not sanction them. And yet they're out there speaking what God didn't say. Another passage that came to mind along with Jeremiah is in John 21. And this one, the context of it, beginning at verse 18. When Jesus had some words for Peter to inform him of his death, it was a prophetic statement. In verse 19, signifying by what manner the apostle would die, and when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned around and looked at the disciple whom Jesus loved and said, "What about this man?" And Jesus said, "If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? Follow me." Now look at verse 23. Then the saying went out among the brethren that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? All right, so Jesus was misquoted. A rumor was spread that John would not die. That's not what Jesus said, but people said that's what he said. But he didn't say it. So a misunderstanding circulated. Rumor got out. People had a false idea of the disciple whom Jesus loved. We think it to have been John. But it illustrates the point tonight that if you are in the business of quoting people, it's a very good idea to quote them accurately, not to misquote. All right, we can understand that. There's an ethics involved in that. Yellow journalism and scandal sheets thrive on misquoting people or quoting people out of context. And there's trouble afoot either way. Do you think that there are things that people speak of today in terms of, common phrases that we oftentimes use that are attributed to God, and yet God never actually said them? You think that's possible? Absolutely. And I want to notice just a few of them tonight. I guess, this would be an interesting thing to carry on and involve ourselves and some others, but a few tonight should be sufficient to occupy our thinking. Here are some statements that people oftentimes will repeat. And there may be some truth in them to an extent. And in one sense, yes, they're right, but God never said them. And yet they're attributed to the Lord. And one of them is, God won't put more on you than you can handle. Now, how many times have you heard that? How many times have you said that? God won't put more on you than you can handle. And that's a statement that we intend, and properly so, to be a comforting statement. We want to help somebody who's going through a hard time or a series of hard times. And as we indicated this morning, if it ain't one thing, it's another. And sometimes people get immersed in the problems of life and they don't see any way out, and they wonder how they're going to be able to handle all that has come upon them. And we'll tell them, well, you know, the Lord won't put on you more than you can handle. And that may be true, but did the Lord say that? And where did He say it if He said it? One passage, and I'll get to the passage that you have in mind here in a moment, but one passage we might consider simply by way of comparison is in 2 Corinthians 1 in verses 8 and 9. And notice something that Paul said with regard to his own experience in Asia. 2 Corinthians 1, beginning in verse 8. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of the trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. Now, that reads to me the very opposite of what people oftentimes mean when they say, well, God won't put more on you than you can handle. Paul is telling the church at Corinth here his experience in Asia, that there was an awful lot on him. It was more than he could deal with. It was like the sentence of death. He didn't think he was going to come out of this thing alive. So what do we mean? God won't put more on us than we can handle. Well, here's what we mean by that. We mean what he said in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. That there is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God will, with the temptation, provide also a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Now, the idea of temptation in that passage is not trials. It's temptation to sin. Everyone faces temptation to sin. That's common to everybody. But God will, along with that temptation, provide also a way of escape that you might be able to bear it. It will not be more than you can handle. The temptation, that is, you can handle it. If you will handle it, and you can get out from under that, God will make a way for you. So we tell people, well, God won't put more on you than you can handle. But what the Lord actually said is there's no temptation that you can't handle. Now, there may be some trials in life that will get you down, much like they did Paul in 2 Corinthians 1. But Paul is talking here about temptation in 1 Corinthians 10:13. Another thing we oftentimes say, and we repeat this as a very common phrase, and that is, everything in life, whatever it is, happens for a reason. God has a reason for it. And again, that phrase is intended, as far as I know, to be comforting, to give people some hope, to help them to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And yeah, everything happens for a reason. Now, I may not always know the reason, but we need to be careful in saying, well, this is what God said. Everything happens for a reason. Look for light at the end of the tunnel. Grasp the hope that's there. I can understand that, absolutely. And I believe very strongly in the providence of God. I know that you do too. I know I speak to people who think as I do along these lines. We don't question that whatsoever. God's providence is part of our lives. We depend on it, and we need it. But everything happens for a reason. I'm not omniscient, that's for sure. And I certainly have no idea what the reasons may be of the things that happen to people. And I would be very reluctant to tell someone who's diagnosed with cancer, everything happens for a reason. To tell someone whose child was killed in a hit-and-run accident, everything happens for a reason. To tell someone whose husband left her for another woman, everything happens for a reason. I'm not going to do that. I don't know that. People do follow sin. People do become evil. People do make their choices. And I'm not going to tell somebody everything happens for a reason, as if to put the finger on God for what tragedy has befallen them, if it is a tragedy, and the examples that I used are tragedies. Is there such a thing as chance? Does something just happen, just by chance? In the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, Jesus spoke of a Samaritan who fell among thieves, as you recall, and he was beaten, robbed, and left by the side of the road. And in Luke 10 and verse 31, as Jesus begins the parable, he says, and a priest came that way, passed that way by chance, and walked by on the other side. By chance? You mean things happen by chance? Or does God direct everything that happens in your life? Every thought, every action, and every motive? Are we machines in the hand of a creator, such as some people think we are? Or do some things happen by chance? Indeed, they do. And you're saying, well, preacher, don't you understand Romans 8:28? That all things work together for good to them that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. Yes, I understand. I understand very well. But I'm not sure that that's what Paul's talking about there. Very well could be that the apostle was addressing the matter of salvation, that all that God did to bring about our salvation through the prophecies, through the types, through everything that the Old Testament writers brought together, it all worked together for our good. To them that are called according to His purpose, and that calling comes through the gospel. I understand Romans 8:28, I hope. And I'm not sure that that passage tells me that everything happens for a reason. Because if, as a few years ago, tornadoes rip through West Little Rock and tear up a good part of the city, I'm not going to tell people, you know, everything happens for a reason. That's above my pay grade. God didn't actually say that. That's the point. Now, as far as these things go, it's very easy to blame God, point the finger, weep and cry and moan and yell, why did God allow this to happen? And we enforce that sometimes by telling them, you know, God does things for a reason. And they think they're being punished by God. If you're going to quote people, you quote them accurately. Lord didn't actually say that. That is, everything happens for a reason. Now, let's look at one other phrase that's oftentimes used and attributed to God, and that is, listen to your heart. Listen to your heart. Okay. Your heart. Well, obviously we're not talking about this, are we? You can't listen to that. You can listen to your mind, your conscience, what you think. So listen to your heart. And people quote that as though God said it. Did God say that? Another way of verbalizing this quote, if you will, is let your conscience be your guide. Same thing. That's what the old timers oftentimes said, let your conscience be your guide. Because to them, God spoke through the conscience. And as long as you felt good about it, then it was right. And nobody could take that away from you. Nobody could argue with you on that count, you see. Because you listen to your heart. Trouble is, the heart is very fallible, isn't it? Very fallible. And Paul, just by way of example, as you well know, teaches very well that the heart is fallible. And let's put the word conscience in there. And in Luke 23, or Acts 23 and verse 1, wrong material on the slide. So anyway, I don't know how that happened. I guess I wasn't listening to my heart, maybe. I don't know. But in Acts 23 and verse 1, you remember what Paul said? That I have lived in all good conscience before God to this day. In other words, he never violated his conscience. He always lived consistent with it, and that's commendable in anybody. And in Acts 23:1, those were Paul's words. But then he reminds us in Acts 26:9 that, there was a day when he thought that he ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. That was his heart too, and he listened to his heart, and he persecuted Christians. He threw them in jail. He persecuted the way because he was listening to his heart, you see. Let his conscience be his guide. So he teaches us, does he not, that, there's a problem there. The conscience is not what guides you. Your conscience is what approves or disapproves what you judge to be right or wrong. And here's what I mean by that. If you judge it to be right to blow up infidels along with yourself so that you can have a sure ticket to heaven, then your conscience will say, that's exactly what you ought to do. Your judgment says it's right. Your conscience approves of it. If your judgment says it's wrong to shoot people, kill people, then your conscience will approve that too. And if you do it anyway, then your conscience for the moment will condemn you for it because you've acted against your judgment. If you believe that it's right to take the gospel to the world and to support those who do, your conscience will approve you in doing that. In supporting the search program, in supporting Mark Teskey, in supporting whoever it is that actively takes the word out. Your judgment says that's the thing you need to do. Your conscience approves when you do it. That's what conscience does. And we say, well, listen to your heart. And people say that all the time. And we know the Lord didn't actually say that. But people attribute it to him as though he did. You know what? If we, and we are in the business of speaking for God, we're to teach his word, quoting him, preaching His Word. We're in that business. So, as Peter said, 1 Peter 4 and verse 11, if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. In other words, if you quote God, quote Him right. Quote Him accurately. Don't misquote Him. Don't attribute to God things He didn't say. But speak as the oracles of God. And that's our business, isn't it? With the year 2025 very close, within a few days, I hope that you will want to spend more and more of your time reading, studying, learning, growing, understanding, imbibing God's Word, so that we know the difference between phrases that are popular, attributed to God, that God never said, and yet what God actually did say. And we bank on that. And we let that be our North Star. And we take that to the world. That's the gospel. Now, there's a big difference between what God never said and what God actually said. And, you know, I quote sources or statements attributed to Mark Twain and to Abraham Lincoln and to Vince Lombardi. And those guys were good in their own right, but they don't mean anything compared to Jesus. So we want to preach what the Lord said. Teach the Lord's will, that and that only. And that is what will drive us and keep us. All right. We understand the difference, and we want to maintain what's right and speaking only what God said. You understand the gospel, to hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized, as we like to repeat it often to the hungry hearts of people. We hope, hungry hearts anyway, who will hear it and learn it and obey it. Maybe tonight you're in that situation. We hope you will as we stand together and sing, respond to it.